The Lamborghini came in hot. Not the cool, theatrical kind of hot that rich men perform when they want attention. This was desperate hot. The kind that smells like burning oil, spilled blood, and a man running out of time. Ruby Hayes heard it before she saw it, a high-pitched mechanical scream tearing through the desert silence, like someone had taken a perfectly engineered Italian machine and tried to kill it. She set down her wrench, wiped her hands on her jeans, and stepped out of the garage bay, just as a matte black Huracan fishtailed off Route 85 and skidded into her lot, leaving a long black scar across the concrete she'd just swept that morning. She stared at the scar, then at the car, then at the man who climbed out of it. He was tall, the kind of tall that made door frames nervous. Dark suit, now ruined. A jaw that looked like it had been cut from the same Arizona rock surrounding them. One hand pressed firmly against his left ribs, and he moved with the specific, controlled limp of someone who refused to let pain show, but wasn't quite winning that argument. His eyes found her immediately. Dark, calculating, and, for just a fraction of a second, surprised, like he'd expected anyone except a woman in oil-stained overalls, standing alone in the middle of the desert. "You the mechanic?" he asked. "You're bleeding on my driveway," she replied. He looked down. A slow, dark stain was spreading beneath his hand, soaking through the white of his dress shirt. He looked back up like she'd pointed out something mildly inconvenient, like a parking ticket. "The car," he said. "Can you fix it?" Ruby crossed her arms and walked a slow circle around the Lamborghini. The front bumper was cracked. The rear quarter panel had taken what looked like 3 bullets, maybe 4. The undercarriage was dragging something it shouldn't have been, grinding faintly even now. The hood latch had a dent in it that made her stomach tighten in a way she didn't immediately understand. She stopped at the driver's side and looked at him over the roof. "Depends," she said. "What did you hit?" "Not what," he said. "Who?" A normal person would have stepped back. Ruby didn't move. "You're going to need 2, maybe 3 hours," she said. "New caliper on the rear left. The bumper I can zip tie well enough to get you somewhere with real parts. Undercarriage, I need it done in 45 minutes. Then you're going to need a miracle worker." Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. More like a man remembering what smiling felt like. "Fix my Lambo," he said, "and I'll marry you." Ruby looked at him for a long, flat moment. "Is that the best offer you've got?" "Most women seem to think so." "I'm not most women." She pulled on her gloves. "And that's not my best offer either. Go sit inside. There's water on the counter. Don't bleed on the tools." He opened his mouth to say something, probably something that worked better in boardrooms and back alleys than it would here, and then closed it. He walked inside without another word. His name was Marco Bellini. Ruby didn't know that yet. But she knew the Lamborghini. She knew the way the bullet holes were angled. Not a roadside ambush. Too precise for that. Someone had been riding with him, or just behind him, and they knew exactly which angle would cripple the car without finishing the driver. They wanted him alive. That was the first detail that didn't sit right. She popped the hood. The engine was a mess, heat warped, and stress beyond what the damage alone could explain, like the car had been pushed well past its limits before it ever got shot. She leaned in, flashlight in her teeth, checking the coolant lines. And then she stopped. There, beneath the hood latch, scratched into the metal in a pattern so small most people would mistake it for a factory imperfection, was a symbol. Thin, deliberate lines. An arrow folding back on itself with a single horizontal mark cutting through the center. Ruby's flashlight hand went still. She knew that symbol. She had grown up being taught never to ignore it. She straightened slowly, walked to the bay door, looked out at the road, empty in both directions, nothing but flat desert heat shimmer, and the distant white scratch of a highway she'd been watching her whole life. She went back inside. Marco was sitting on an upturned crate, drinking water with the controlled patience of a man who had learned to conserve everything: energy, emotion, trust. He watched her come in, watched her pull off one glove, then the other, watched her not pick up a single tool. "What are you doing?" he said. "Not fixing your car," she said. His eyes went cold. "Excuse me?" "That symbol under your hood latch." She held his gaze. "Someone marked your car. Anyone who repairs this Lamborghini, at any garage, anywhere, triggers a notification. Whoever put that mark there finds out exactly where you stopped, how long you stayed, and which direction you left in." Marco's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "You've had at least 2, maybe 3 stops since yesterday," Ruby said. "Am I wrong?" A pause, longer than she expected. "No," he said quietly. "Then every mechanic you trusted today handed your location to someone who wants you alive and controllable." She picked up her keys from the counter. "If I start working on that car, we have maybe 20 minutes before they arrive." Marco stood up slowly, and now the controlled stillness was gone. Something harder had replaced it. The real version of him, she suspected. "Who are you?" She was already moving toward the back of the garage, pulling up a floor panel she'd installed herself, revealing a concrete tunnel that dropped into cool darkness below. "Someone who recognizes that symbol," she said, "and someone who knows you can't trust a single person in your convoy right now." She looked back at him. "The question isn't who I am. The question is whether you're going to stand there bleeding and asking questions while they drive up, or whether you're going to follow me." Outside, at the far edge of the desert road, a dust cloud was rising. 3 vehicles, moving fast. Marco Bellini, feared, powerful, and completely outmaneuvered, looked at the woman he'd just offered to marry as a joke, then at the rising dust, then back at her. He followed her into the dark. The Lamborghini sat alone in the lot, engines still ticking, hood still open, waiting, exactly as Ruby intended, like bait on a hook. The tunnel smelled like old concrete and motor oil. Ruby moved through it fast, her flashlight cutting a narrow blade of light ahead of them. Marco followed, one hand still pressed to his ribs, his breathing controlled but labored. The tunnel was low. He had to hunch slightly, which he clearly hated. Men like him weren't built for small spaces or borrowed escapes. "How far does this go?" he asked. "Far enough," she said. He didn't push it. She noticed that about him. He asked one question, absorbed the answer, and moved on. No repetition, no panic. Whatever else Marco Bellini was, he wasn't someone who wasted energy on noise. Behind them, muffled through concrete and distance, came the sound of vehicles pulling into her lot. Doors, voices, the sharp crack of something being kicked over, probably her tool cart. Ruby's jaw tightened, but she kept moving. That cart had taken her 4 months to organize. They surfaced 20 minutes later through a rusted cellar door hidden beneath a collapsed water tower, half a mile east of the garage. The Nevada state line was close enough to taste. The sun was beginning its slow, orange descent, painting the desert in colors that had no business looking that beautiful, given the circumstances. A dented pickup truck sat waiting beside the water tower, keys above the visor. Marco looked at it, then at her. "You planned for this," he said. It wasn't an accusation. It was almost respectful. "I planned for everything," Ruby said, climbing in. They drove for 2 hours without significant conversation, which suited them both. Ruby took unmarked roads, old ranch routes, cracked and forgotten, the kind that didn't appear on any GPS. Marco watched the side mirror with the quiet vigilance of a man who'd spent his life watching exits. His breathing had steadied, which meant the rib was bruised, not broken. She'd seen enough workshop injuries to know the difference. Just past the Nevada border, she turned off a dirt road and pulled up to what looked, at first glance, like an abandoned gas station. Weeds pushing through concrete, faded signage, two dead pumps wearing rust like old coats. But the padlock on the side door was brand new. Ruby unlocked it with a key she kept on a chain beneath her overalls. Inside, behind a wall of empty shelving units, was a second door. Behind that, a staircase. And beneath the staircase, a room that felt older than the building above it. Stone walls, a single work lamp, a fold-out table covered in maps, notebooks, and coffee cups that had seen better decades. Sitting in the corner, adjusting a carburetor he almost certainly didn't need to adjust, was an elderly man named Walt. Walt had the hands of someone who had spent 60 years inside engines, and the eyes of someone who had spent 30 of those years regretting certain decisions. He looked up when they entered, looked at Marco, then at Ruby. "You brought company," he said. "Company brought itself," she replied. "I just redirected it." Walt set the carburetor down. He looked at Marco for a long moment, not afraid, not impressed, just measuring. "Who hit your convoy?" Walt asked. Marco's eyes narrowed. "You know who I am." "I know what that suit costs," Walt said. "Sit down. Let me see the car." "There is no car," Ruby said. "I left it." Walt raised both eyebrows. That, apparently, impressed him. Ruby set the Lamborghini's hood panel sketch on the table. She'd copied the symbol quickly by hand before they ran. Walt studied it under the lamp, his expression shifting from curious to troubled to something she couldn't fully name. "Second generation, Mark," he said quietly. "Modified." "Modified how?" Ruby asked. "This isn't just a location trigger." Walt pointed to the horizontal cut through the center of the symbol. "That line, that's a timer mark. Whoever placed this wasn't just tracking where the car stopped. They were counting stops. Every repair, every garage, every mechanic who touched this vehicle got logged." He looked up. Someone was building a list. "A list of what?" Marco said. "Of everyone still loyal to the old network," Walt said. "Mechanics who could be trusted. The ones who recognized the mark and stayed quiet." He paused. "Someone's been hunting them." The room went very still. Ruby felt something cold settle in her chest. She thought about the garages she knew, the people in them. People who'd shown her kindness when her father... She stopped that thought before it finished. "How long has this been running?" she asked. Walt opened a drawer and pulled out a small notebook, thumbed to a page near the back. "Based on this modification pattern, 8 months, maybe more." 8 months. Systematic. Patient. Whoever was behind this hadn't panicked and moved fast. They'd been careful, quiet, and thorough. The most dangerous combination. Marco was staring at the symbol. His expression had changed. Not fear. Something closer to fury turned inward. The look of a man realizing he'd been walking through a carefully constructed maze without knowing the walls existed. "Someone in my convoy," he said slowly. "Someone I trusted." "Someone who's been trusted a long time," Walt replied grimly. "Those are always the worst kind." A sound from above, sudden, heavy. All three of them looked at the ceiling. Footsteps. More than one person. Walt moved faster than a man his age had any right to. He grabbed the notebook and pressed it into Ruby's hands. "Back tunnel," he said. "Behind the water heater. Go!" "Walt!" "Go, Ruby!" His voice was quiet and absolute. "I'll buy you 2 minutes." She wanted to argue. She looked at his face, decided, peaceful in a way that frightened her more than the footsteps, and grabbed Marco's arm. They ran. Behind them, the smell of smoke was already beginning to drift down the stairs. Walt didn't follow. They didn't speak about Walt, not directly, not yet. Ruby drove through the night with the notebook on her lap and both hands tight on the wheel. Marco sat in the passenger seat, staring at the road ahead with the expression of a man cataloging everything he'd underestimated. The desert gave way to highway, highway gave way to city lights, and somewhere around the California border, Ruby finally let herself breathe at full depth. The notebook was small, wire-bound, water-stained at the corners. Inside, Walt had recorded dozens of coded symbols with handwritten notes beside each one. Locations, dates, vehicle makes. Some entries had names. Most didn't. Several pages had been torn out cleanly, which bothered her more than anything missing could explain. Someone had been here before them. Not tonight. The tiers were old, the edges yellowed. But someone had removed those pages deliberately, long before Walt handed her the notebook. Long before any of this started. She filed that away and kept driving. Marco finally broke the silence somewhere outside Los Angeles. "The symbol in my car," he said. "How did you know what it meant?" Ruby kept her eyes on the road. "My father was a mechanic." "That's not an answer." "It's the only one you're getting tonight." He accepted that. She was beginning to appreciate that about him. He knew when a door was closed, and he didn't stand outside knocking. The notebook led them to a name. Embedded in one of Walt's coded entries, cross-referenced against a vehicle registration and a Los Angeles address, was a man called Gerard Voss. Ruby knew the name distantly, the way you know the names of people too wealthy to be entirely real. Voss owned one of the largest private collections of restored supercars in the world, a climate-controlled museum in the Hollywood Hills that charged $500 a head for private viewings and hosted quarterly auctions that attracted the kind of buyers who paid in arrangements rather than wire transfers. More relevantly, according to Walt's notes, Voss had purchased 11 vehicles in the past 8 months from sellers connected to the mechanic network's compromised garages. 11 vehicles, 8 months, the same timeline. Getting inside required a story. Ruby built one on the drive. A private seller looking to move a 1968 Ferrari 275 GTB, details memorized from a listing she'd found on her phone. Marco played the buyer, which required almost no performance from him. He simply walked into rooms the way he always did, like he already owned them, and people believed whatever framework surrounded that walk. Voss received them personally, which told Ruby he was either genuinely interested or he already knew something about them. She spent the first 20 minutes deciding which. By the time Voss was pouring Marco a second glass of something expensive and rare, she had her answer. He was genuinely greedy. That was both better and worse than the alternative. While the two men talked numbers in the main gallery, Ruby asked to browse the restoration wing. Standard due diligence for a serious seller, she explained. A junior assistant led her through with the bored efficiency of someone who gave the same tour 4 times a week. Ruby looked at the cars. More specifically, she looked inside them. Third vehicle, a 1972 Maserati Bora, burgundy, immaculate. She leaned in to examine the door trim and found it on the inner sill, half hidden beneath a strip of chrome molding. The same family of symbol Walt had described. Different variation, but the same root language. Fifth vehicle, a McLaren F1, late production, under the passenger seat rail. Seventh, a Bugatti EB110, inside the fuel cap housing. By the 9th car, a Porsche 917 in racing white, Ruby had stopped being surprised and started being methodical. She photographed each mark with her phone, noted the vehicle, noted the position. When the assistant's back was turned, she ran her fingers along the interior panels of several cars until she found what she was really looking for. Not marks this time. Compartments. The Porsche had a custom panel behind the rear bulkhead, magnetic sealed, barely thicker than a hardcover book. Inside, a flat USB drive and a manila envelope, unsealed. She pocketed both, without hesitation. She rejoined Marco in the gallery 8 minutes later, met his eyes briefly, and gave the smallest nod. He wrapped up the conversation with Voss in under 3 minutes, politely, with genuine-sounding regret about the seller's timeline.
and they were outside within 15. In the car, she opened the envelope. Inside were photographs. Surveillance quality, taken at distance. Various locations. A Geneva hotel lobby. A Miami marina. A private airfield outside Prague. In every photograph, the same cluster of men appeared alongside different vehicles, with the same careful staging. Cars positioned just so, doors open, as if being admired. They weren't being admired. They were being exchanged. Not sold. Exchanged. One vehicle arriving, another departing. Small cases and sealed folders moving between them in the background, casual as luggage. Marco leaned over and went very still when he reached the fourth photograph. Ruby looked at him. "What?" she said. He pulled the photograph closer to the light. In the background, half turned toward the camera, stood an older man in a grey suit. Distinguished. Sharp. The kind of face that appeared in newspapers, beside words like philanthropist and legacy. It was Marco's father. Dead 6 years. Photographed, according to the timestamp in the corner, 4 years ago. Marco said nothing for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was very quiet. "My father built his empire from nothing," he said. "That's what I was always told." Ruby waited. "I don't think that's true anymore," he said. Marco didn't sleep. Ruby knew because she didn't either, and the silence between them during the long drive to Colorado had a different texture than before. Earlier, it had been the silence of two strangers being careful. Now it was the silence of two people carrying weight they hadn't agreed to carry, sitting close enough to feel the other's tension without knowing what to do with their own. The photograph sat in the envelope on the back seat. Neither of them mentioned it again, but it was the loudest thing in the car. Walt's notebook contained one entry written differently from the others, not in code, but in plain handwriting, small and deliberate, like someone who wanted to be understood clearly for once. A name, an address in a mountain town called Sable Creek, Colorado. And beneath the address, 3 words that functioned less like a description and more like a warning. She built them. The town was the kind of place that appeared on maps, but not in conversations. One main road, one diner, one hardware store that doubled as a post office. The kind of town where everyone knew the sound of every car engine. So a vehicle they didn't recognize arriving before sunrise meant curtains moved quietly in several windows at once. The address led them to a small house at the edge of town, pressed against the tree line, like it was trying not to be noticed. Flower boxes in the windows, a wind chime made from old spark plugs hanging beside the door. A ramp installed over the front step. Recently, the concrete was still pale at the edges. Ruby knocked. A long pause.
Then the sound of deliberate movement, careful, unhurried. The door opened. The woman was perhaps 75, small-framed, with white hair pulled back severely, and eyes the specific shade of gray that made Ruby think of winter mornings and people who had made difficult decisions so many times it no longer showed on their faces. She looked at Ruby first, then at Marco, then back at Ruby, and something shifted in her expression. Not recognition exactly, more like the feeling of a calculation finally resolving. "I wondered when someone would come," she said. "Come inside. I just made coffee." Her name was Estelle Marsh. Estelle had been a mechanic for 40 years before her hands made that impossible. She'd built her reputation quietly across 3 states, working on vehicles that other mechanics refused, not because they were too damaged, but because their owners were too dangerous. She'd learned early that the safest position in a room full of powerful men was the one they all needed, but never truly saw. Mechanics, she explained, moving slowly between the counter and the table, were invisible in a way that almost no other profession was. They saw the undersides of things. They knew secrets by proximity rather than intention. and secrets, in the right hands, became protection. She had built the symbol system 40 years ago, not as espionage, she was clear about that, as self-defense, a quiet language that let honest mechanics warn each other about dangerous vehicles, compromised owners, routes being watched. Nothing political, nothing ambitious, just people in greasy overalls trying to stay alive while doing their jobs. For decades it worked exactly as she'd intended. Then it got noticed. Ruby had been listening carefully, hands wrapped around her coffee cup. When Estelle paused, she asked the question she'd been holding since Nevada. "My father," she said. "Was he part of the network?" Estelle set her cup down slowly. "Daniel Hayes," she said. "Yes." The name in Estelle's mouth, her father's name, spoken by a stranger with that particular weight of familiarity, hit Ruby somewhere behind the sternum. "He helped me expand the system in the late 90s, Estelle continued. Brilliant at pattern design. He understood how people read surfaces, what the eye skips over, what it catches. He made the symbols smaller, more embedded, harder to find unless you knew what you were looking for." She paused. "He was one of the best people I ever worked with." "He died 15 years ago," Ruby said. "A garage fire." Estelle looked at her for a moment, with an expression that was almost apologetic. "No," she said gently. "He didn't." The room was very still. "The fire was real," Estelle said, "but Daniel set it himself. He needed to disappear. He'd discovered that several mechanics inside the network, trusted people he'd trained personally, had begun selling information, not to small operators, to people with the kind of money that turns systems into weapons. She folded her hands on the table. "He came to me first. We agreed the only way to protect what remained was for him to go inside, to make them believe he was gone, then surface within the organization that was corrupting the network, feed them false confidence while protecting whoever he could." Ruby realized her hands had stopped feeling the warmth of the cup. "He's alive," she said. It wasn't quite a question. "As of 8 months ago, yes," Estelle said. "The last symbol he sent me was through a vehicle that passed through Denver. He was still operational, still protecting people." Marco leaned forward. "Can you decode where he is now?" Estelle opened her mouth to answer. Then she stopped. Her hand went to her throat, slowly, with a confused expression, like she'd forgotten a word mid-sentence and couldn't understand why. She looked at Ruby. "The coffee," she said, barely a whisper. "I didn't make it."
"I found it already." She reached across the table and gripped Ruby's wrist with surprising strength. "Don't trust," she said, each word arriving separately with enormous effort. "The perfect repairs." Her hand went slack. Ruby caught her before she hit the table. Marco was already at the window, scanning the tree line. Somewhere in the house, behind them, close, a door that had been left slightly open swung gently, as though someone had just walked through it. Or just left. They buried Estelle's secret the only way she would have wanted, by using it. Ruby spent the drive to Chicago memorizing every symbol in Walt's notebook. Not reading, memorizing. The way her father had taught her to memorize engine sounds when she was 7 years old, sitting on an upturned crate in his garage while he quizzed her with his eyes closed. "Don't look at the part, Ruby. Listen to what it's telling you." She hadn't understood then. She was beginning to understand now. Marco drove. His eyes moved between road and mirror in a rhythm so automatic it had become unconscious. At one point, somewhere in the flat middle of Kansas, he glanced at her with the notebook open across her knees,
and said nothing for a long moment. "You're memorizing it," he said finally. "Someone already tore pages out of this notebook," she replied without looking up. "I'm not trusting paper." He nodded once and went back to watching the road. That was the thing about Marco Bellini that kept catching her off guard. She'd spent the first day waiting for the version of him she'd expected, demanding, territorial, the kind of man who filled rooms with his own authority and called it leadership. That man existed. She'd seen him in the garage lot, stepping out of the Lamborghini like the desert owed him something. But there was another version underneath, quieter and considerably more unsettling, because it was genuine. He noticed things. He adapted without announcing it. And he had not once, in 4 days, treated her knowledge as something that needed his endorsement before it counted. She wasn't sure what to do with that. Chicago arrived gray and loud, the skyline pressing down under heavy cloud cover. Ruby navigated from memory through the industrial district south of the river, an area of wide streets and low buildings where businesses had sensible names and asked very few questions. The mechanic network, Walt had once explained, wasn't a hierarchy. It had no headquarters, no leader since Estelle had retired. It was a web, hundreds of independent garages, each knowing only the few nodes directly connected to them, which made it resilient. It also meant that with enough patience and enough access, someone could systematically work inward from the edges without the setter ever feeling the pressure until it was too late. Ruby knew 3 garages in Chicago. She trusted 2 of them. She visited the one she didn't trust first. It was a body shop on the west side, clean, well-lit, run by a man named Carver, who Ruby had met twice at network gatherings years ago. Friendly, good with customers, always had coffee on. Too clean, she thought, pulling up outside. The kind of clean that takes effort to maintain in a working garage. The kind that means someone cares very much about appearances. She went in alone. Marco waited in the car 2 blocks east. Carver remembered her. Warm handshake, genuine smile, immediate offer of coffee. She declined the coffee. She was declining all coffee now, a new policy, and explained she was passing through with a vehicle that needed a minor alignment check, nothing serious. While Carver's assistant pulled the car into the bay, a borrowed vehicle she'd acquired that morning specifically for this, Ruby stood near the tool wall and scratched a symbol low on the doorframe of the office. Small, deliberate, meaningless. She'd invented it 20 minutes ago. Then she left, thanked Carver warmly, and told him she'd be in touch. She rejoined Marco.
"Now we wait," she said. "For what? For whoever Carver calls." They didn't wait long. 4 hours later, parked half a mile from the second garage on her list, a place she actually trusted, run by a woman named Diane who'd known Ruby's father, 2 men arrived, asking about a vehicle matching the borrowed car's description. They showed Diane a photograph. The photograph was of Ruby. Marco watched them leave from the passenger seat, his expression unreadable. Then he looked at her. "Carver," he said. "Carver," she confirmed. She wrote his name in the margin of Walt's notebook, the first name added in her own handwriting. It felt significant in a way she didn't entirely like. "How many more?" Marco asked. "I don't know," she said honestly. "That's the problem. Estelle said don't trust the perfect repairs. I think she meant the mechanics who seemed most reliable. The ones who passed every test are the ones who've been most carefully placed." Marco was quiet for a moment. "That's how I would do it," he said, "if I were building a network inside a network." "I know," she said. "That's why it works." She watched him process that, the specific discomfort of recognizing an enemy's method because it mirrors your own. Marco Bellini had built his reputation on exactly that kind of long patience, and now someone had used it against him. She waited for him to be angry about it. Instead, he looked at her and said, "So we keep feeding false symbols, flush them out, one by one." "Yes," she said. "How many garages do you know?" "Enough," she said. "But Marco—" She hesitated, choosing the next words carefully. "Whoever is running this isn't reacting to us. They're anticipating us. Which means somewhere in your organization, someone is still reporting." Marco's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I know," he said quietly. "Do you know who?" He looked out the window at the gray Chicago sky. "I have a suspicion," he said. "I've had it for 2 days." "And?" "And I'm hoping I'm wrong," he said. "Because if I'm right, it changes everything I thought I'd built." Ruby looked at his profile, steady, controlled, carrying something enormous behind both eyes. And for the first time since a damaged Lamborghini had screamed into her lot, she felt something other than urgency. She felt the specific, inconvenient ache of beginning to care about someone's pain. She looked back at the road. Neither of them said anything else. But this time, the silence was different. The invitation arrived through Diane, not digitally, physically, slipped inside the door panel of a restored 1969 Ford Mustang that had passed through her garage 3 days earlier. Cream-colored card, no return address, embossed with a single symbol Ruby now recognized as a high-clearance network mark, the kind that meant this came from someone who knows everything. 2 names were printed inside, not their real names, but their names nonetheless, which meant someone already knew exactly where they were and had chosen an invitation over an ambush. Ruby turned that over carefully. An ambush was a solution. An invitation was a negotiation. Whoever sent this wanted something from them that couldn't be taken by force. That was either very reassuring or considerably more dangerous. She hadn't decided which. The event was held on a private island 40 minutes by chartered boat from the Florida coast, the kind of island that didn't appear on public maps, not because it was hidden, but because the people who owned such things had long ago made their privacy a structural feature of the world rather than a personal preference. Getting there required the kind of clothes neither of them had packed for a cross-country survival run. Marco solved that problem with a single phone call he made from a gas station payphone, the existence of which surprised Ruby more than anything else that had happened this week.
20 minutes later, a car arrived with 2 garment bags in the back seat and a driver who asked no questions. Ruby looked at the dress. Midnight blue, her exact size. "How did you know?" she asked. "I estimated," Marco said, already walking toward the car. She stood there for 1 moment longer than was strictly necessary. The island was extraordinary in the way that only obscene wealth could manufacture. Everything beautiful, everything deliberate, nothing accidental. White pavilions strung with warm light, vintage automobiles displayed on raised platforms like sculpture. Waitstaff moving through guests with the silent efficiency of people paid enough to become invisible. The guests were titans: industry, finance, tech, old European money sitting comfortably beside new American excess. Ruby had grown up watching these people from the outside of their vehicles, and seeing them up close was both less and more impressive than she'd imagined. Less because they were simply people, more because of how completely they had organized the world around their comfort. Marco moved through the crowd with a naturalness that she noted but didn't comment on. He belonged here in a way she didn't, not because of money, but because he understood the grammar of power,
The way these conversations worked, what was being said beneath what was being said. She watched him from across the room and found herself thinking that he was considerably more complicated than a matte black Lamborghini and a badly timed marriage joke had suggested. She shook that thought loose and went to work. Her cover was the restoration team, 6 mechanics flown in to perform live display maintenance on the exhibited vehicles. She'd intercepted the real invitation through Diane's network contact, replaced one name on the crew list, and arrived with tools that were entirely genuine and hands that knew exactly what they were doing. The vehicles told her everything, not through the symbols this time, through the parts themselves. 3 separate cars contained custom-fabricated components that had no mechanical purpose whatsoever. Hollow panels, modified air chambers. In one vehicle, an entirely fake secondary fuel system built around a sealed cavity the size of a briefcase. She opened one carefully, shielded by the raised hood, and found inside a flat steel case containing a hard drive and a folded document dense with financial routing numbers. These cars weren't being displayed, they were being exchanged. Bought and sold not for money, but as vessels, each vehicle carrying information worth infinitely more than its sticker price. Ledgers, blackmail architecture, encrypted transfers. The automobiles were moving confidential cargo between people who could never be seen handing each other anything. The genius of it was its simplicity. Nobody searched a vintage Ferrari at a legitimate auction. Ruby was photographing the 3rd hidden compartment when she felt a hand close firmly around her arm. Not Marco, a man she didn't recognize, large, unhurried, with the specific dead-eyed patience of professional security. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. His grip communicated everything with complete clarity. She was about to start calculating options when she heard, from across the pavilion, the sharp sound of a conversation stopping. She looked up. Marco was standing very still near the main display platform, surrounded by 3 men in dark suits who had arranged themselves with the casual geometry of people who do this professionally. One of them had said something that had made the nearest guests quietly relocate. His eyes found hers across the distance. In that single look, she read the entire calculation he'd just made. The risk, the decision, the outcome he'd chosen. He gave the smallest nod. Then he turned to the men surrounding him and said something that made 2 of them reach for his arms. He let them take him. Deliberately. Willingly. Trading his own capture to create the 3 seconds of distraction that made the man holding Ruby's arm turn his head. 3 seconds was enough. She slipped free, palmed the hard drive and documents from the open compartment, and walked at a measured pace toward the service exit. Behind her, the auction continued without interruption. Nobody saw her leave. That was the thing about mechanics at events like this. They were invisible. Ruby didn't run. Running attracted attention. Instead, she walked, measured, purposeful, tool bag over one shoulder, through the service corridor and out onto the dock where the maintenance boats were moored. She stepped into the smallest one, started the engine with the focused calm of someone who had been starting engines her whole life, and left the island without looking back. She allowed herself to look back once she was far enough out that the lights had shrunk to a warm cluster on the dark water. Marco was still in there. She sat with that for exactly 60 seconds, the fear of it, the helplessness of it, and then she put it somewhere practical and started thinking. The hard drive was encrypted. The documents, however, were not. 40 minutes later, anchored in a quiet marina on the Florida coast, Ruby spread the papers under a small battery lamp and read. Most of it was financial architecture, shell companies layered inside other shell companies, the kind of structure that existed not to move money, but to make money untraceable. She understood enough to recognize the scale. This wasn't organized crime in the traditional sense. This was something that had grown through and around organized crime, the way a vine grows through a fence, using the structure for support while quietly consuming it. 3 names appeared repeatedly across the documents. She didn't recognize 2 of them. The third she did. Vincent Caro, Marco's second-in-command, his most trusted lieutenant. The man who had been running the Bellini organization's daily operations for 11 years. Ruby stared at that name for a long time. Then she picked up the phone Diane had given her, clean, untraceable, and started tracking the vehicle symbols Marco had received across his convoy route. Working backward through Walt's notebook, cross-referencing dates and locations, she built a map of the betrayal, 1 data point at a time. Every significant ambush in the past 8 months had followed a stop where Vincent Caro had personally arranged the vehicle maintenance. Every one. The convoy ambush that had brought Marco screaming into her garage hadn't been a lucky hit. It had been a carefully arranged near miss, close enough to feel real, controlled enough to keep Marco alive and frightened and dependent on outside help, which would then lead him directly into the mechanic network, which would then expose every remaining loyal contact inside it. She had been part of the plan without knowing it. That realization sat in her stomach like cold metal. She pulled out Walt's notebook and stared at the torn pages, the ones removed long before any of this began. Someone had known about the notebook's existence, someone with access, with patience, with a long view, someone who had been inside both worlds simultaneously. She found the Detroit address in the financial documents almost by accident, a warehouse facility listed under a logistics company that appeared in 3 separate shell structures. Cross-referenced against a vehicle registration in Walt's notes and a delivery timestamp in the documents, it resolved into something specific, not a warehouse, an active restoration facility. She started the boat's engine. Detroit arrived at dawn, steel-gray sky over steel-gray water, the city's old industrial bones visible everywhere beneath its newer skin. The facility was in the Eastern District, a massive building that from the outside looked like every other abandoned manufacturing plant in a neighborhood full of them. From the inside, Ruby discovered, it was the opposite of abandoned. She entered through a ventilation access she found after 20 minutes of careful exterior assessment, a habit her father had instilled in her before she was tall enough to see over a car hood. Never use the door someone built for you, Ruby. Find the one they forgot about. The facility floor was vast and brilliantly lit. Dozens of vehicles in various stages of restoration, but these weren't being restored for collectors. The modifications she could see from the catwalk above were the same as the auction vehicles. Hidden compartments, false panels, custom cavities, an assembly line of deception scaled up far beyond what she'd imagined. She was still processing the scale of it when a hand touched her shoulder from behind. She spun, tool raised. "Easy," said a voice she had never heard before, but somehow recognized immediately. Low, careful, worn smooth by years of saying as little as possible. The man was perhaps 60, medium height, with a mechanic's hands and a face that had learned stillness the hard way. Grey at the temples, a scar along the left jaw she didn't remember from photographs, but recognized anyway. She recognized him because she recognized herself in him. The jawline, the eyes, the specific way he held absolutely still when he was reading a situation. "Ruby," he said, not a question. "Dad," she said. The word came out smaller than she intended. Daniel Hayes looked at his daughter for a long moment, absorbing 15 years of her face, she realized, in real time, and whatever composure he'd spent decades building showed its first fracture. Brief, controlled, real. "I know," he said quietly. "I know what I owe you." "Later," she said, and was surprised by how steady her own voice was. "Marco Bellini is somewhere in this building." Her father nodded. "Sub-level 2. They took him an hour ago." He paused. Vincent Caro arrived 20 minutes behind him. Ruby felt everything clarify at once, the way an engine does when the right part finally seats correctly. "And you've been inside this organization for 15 years,
she said. Yes. Then you know where everything is? Yes. Good, she said, and handed him a wrench from her tool bag. Show me. Her father almost smiled. Sub-level 2 was exactly where her father said it would be. They moved through the facility's lower corridor with the quiet efficiency of two people who understood the same language. Not words, but space. When to stop, when to move, which shadows were safe, and which ones breathed. Ruby had spent her whole life thinking she'd learned these instincts from solitude, from years alone in a desert garage, building habits out of necessity. She understood now that she'd inherited them. The door was heavy steel, key-coded, with a secondary manual bolt that suggested whoever built this room had trusted electronics only so far. Her father bypassed the keypad in 40 seconds, using a technique so specific and unhurried that Ruby recognized it immediately. He taught me that, she thought, through a book he left behind. I thought I'd figured it out myself. Inside, Marco was seated, not restrained, which told her something. They weren't finished with him yet. He looked up when the door opened, and the expression that crossed his face when he saw Ruby lasted less than a second before discipline covered it. But she caught it. Relief. Genuine, unguarded, and followed immediately by something quieter. She filed that away. We need to move, she said. Marco stood. His eyes moved to her father. Who is this? Later, Ruby said, exactly as she'd said it to her father upstairs. Marco looked at her, then at Daniel Hayes. Something in the resemblance registered. The jaw, the stillness, and she watched him recalibrate without asking another question. She was starting to like that about him more than was professionally convenient.
They were 3 corridors from the exit when they heard Vincent Caro's voice. He was on the floor above. She could hear him through a ventilation grate, speaking to someone with the relaxed authority of a man who believed he was untouchable. And why wouldn't he? 11 years of loyalty performed with enough care and precision that Marco Bellini, one of the most suspicious men alive, had never once looked at him sideways. Ruby stopped at the grate. Her father touched her arm. Keep moving. She shook her head. 1 minute. Caro was explaining the next phase. Unhurried, detailed, methodical. He spoke about the mechanic network in the past tense, as something already finished, already neutralized. He spoke about Marco as a loose end to be resolved cleanly once the facility's database had been transferred. He spoke about Ruby's father as the only remaining variable. 15 years of carefully maintained deception, reduced to the word variable. She looked at her father's face. He was listening with the expression of someone who had long ago stopped expecting better from people and had simply begun working around it. They kept moving. Outside, grey Detroit dawn coming up cold and flat. Marco breathed the open air for a moment and said nothing. Then he turned to Daniel Hayes with the direct, assessing look that Ruby had seen him use exactly twice before, both times with people he'd decided to trust. The database, Marco said. Everything they have, evidence, contacts, financial routing, ledgers, it's still inside. I know where it is, her father said. I built 3 of the backup systems myself. Can you destroy it? I can do better than that, her father said. I can copy it first. Ruby looked at him. That's not part of the plan. It is now, he said simply. Destroying it protects the billionaires, makes everything disappear cleanly. Copying it first means we control what gets released and to whom. Courts, journalists, regulatory bodies in 7 countries. He paused. I've been waiting 15 years for enough evidence to make this permanent. It's all in that building. Ruby wanted to argue. She looked at the building, then at her father, then at the ground, running the risk calculation the way she ran mechanical diagnostics, systematically, without sentiment. How long? She said. 40 minutes. We'll wait, Marco said immediately.
Ruby looked at him. "We'll wait," he repeated, quieter, meant for her. Her father went back inside alone. They sat on the hood of a car they'd borrowed from the facility's outer lot, another thing neither of them commented on, while the sky turned from grey to pale gold above the Detroit skyline. Marco was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Caro has been with me since the beginning. I gave him everything." "I know," Ruby said. "I built things I thought were mine," he said. "Turns out I was building them for someone else the entire time." He wasn't asking for sympathy. He was simply placing the fact somewhere outside himself and looking at it. "My father faked his own death," Ruby said. "I spent 15 years thinking I wasn't worth staying for." Marco turned to look at her. "It wasn't that," he said. "I know that now," she said. "Doesn't mean the 15 years felt different." He held her gaze for a moment with an expression she couldn't fully name. It was somewhere between understanding and something that had no clean mechanical equivalent she could reach for. "When this is over," he said quietly, "the joke I made in your garage." "It wasn't a joke," she said. Not confrontationally, just accurately. "No," he said. "It stopped being one around day 3. Ruby looked at the building. "Survive first," she said. "Is that a condition or a promise?" he asked. She almost smiled. "Both." 43 minutes later, her father walked out carrying a single hard drive and a look of absolute finality. Behind him, smoke was beginning to rise from the building's upper vents.
He handed Ruby the drive without ceremony. "Everything," he said. "Every name, every transaction, every vehicle. 15 years. He looked at Marco. "My daughter trusted you with her life," he said. "I'll trust you with this." He pressed a second copy of the drive into Marco's hands. Then he stepped back. "I'll find my own way from here," he said. "There are still people inside this network who need warning." Ruby opened her mouth. "Ruby." His voice was gentle and immovable. "This is how I finish it." She looked at his face, the jaw, the stillness, everything she'd inherited without knowing its origin, and understood that arguing would be its own kind of disrespect. She hugged him instead, brief, fierce. 15 years compressed into 10 seconds. He held on for all 10. Then he walked away down the gray Detroit street, hands in his pockets, unhurried, already becoming a different kind of invisible. Marco stood beside her and didn't say anything, which was exactly right. They had one hard drive, 2 targets, and a long road to New York. Ruby got behind the wheel. They drove through the night one final time. No tunnel this time, no borrowed pickup on forgotten ranch roads. Just a straight, open highway running northeast through the dark, the kind of drive that feels like the world holding its breath before something changes permanently. Ruby kept both hands on the wheel and let the miles pass. Marco sat beside her with the hard drive on his lap, like it was something fragile, which neither of them would have admitted, but both understood. 15 years of her father's careful, dangerous work. Walt's sacrifice in a burning Nevada station. Estelle's last words through a poisoned throat. Every mechanic who'd scratched a warning into metal and hoped the right person would find it. All of it, compressed onto a device smaller than her palm. She drove carefully. New York arrived the way it always did, gradually, then all at once. The skyline assembling itself on the horizon piece by piece until suddenly it was simply there, enormous and indifferent, the way only very old, powerful things managed to be. They had spent the final hours of the drive building the release architecture. Not a single journalist, not a single law enforcement contact. Marco had explained it with the specific clarity of someone who had spent years understanding how information got buried. One target could be pressured, discredited, or quietly disappeared. One institution could be compromised. But simultaneous release to 47 separate recipients across 12 countries in 6 different languages, timed to arrive within the same 90-second window? That was ungovernable. Ruby had spent 3 hours at a motel outside Philadelphia preparing the packages. Financial records, surveillance archives, vehicle exchange logs, shell company structures, names, dates, transactions. Everything organized with the same methodical precision she applied to a diagnostic report. Every piece labeled, every connection annotated. Marco had contributed something equally important: his own organization's records, voluntarily. Every intelligence operation, every compromised contact, every resource that had unknowingly fed information upward to the billionaire alliance. Ruby had looked at him when he handed her the files. "This exposes you," she said. "I know," he said, significantly. "I know that too," he said. "Build it in." She had. At 6:14 in the morning, from a nondescript office in Midtown Manhattan that Marco had used once before, for reasons he didn't elaborate on, Ruby hit send. 47 simultaneous transmissions. Then she sat back and waited. The first response came within 11 minutes. A financial journalist in London whose encrypted inbox had just received documentation that contradicted 15 years of public statements from one of Europe's most celebrated industrialists. By the second hour, 3 of the billionaire syndicate's members had issued contradictory public statements that inadvertently confirmed details they hadn't known were already public. By the 4th hour, 2 governments had opened formal investigations. By the end of the day, the syndicate's members had stopped protecting each other entirely. 15 years of carefully maintained mutual insurance collapsed in the specific way that corrupt alliances always collapse. Not from outside pressure, but from the moment each member calculated that betraying the others was safer than staying loyal. They turned on each other with the enthusiasm of people who had always wanted to. Vincent Caro was arrested at a private airfield outside Miami before his plane reached the runway. He said nothing to the authorities. Ruby imagined he was still trying to understand how the evidence had surfaced from a facility that had burned from the inside out. She didn't feel satisfaction exactly. She felt the specific quiet of a job completed correctly. 3 weeks passed. Ruby went home. The garage was exactly as she'd left it, minus the Lamborghini, which had presumably been collected by someone, and plus a long black tire scar across the concrete lot that she was going to need to pressure wash on a Tuesday when the light was good. She opened the bay doors, turned on the work lamp, and stood in the familiar smell of oil and metal and hot Arizona morning. Everything in its place. Everything exactly as it should be. She was under a transmission by 9 o'clock, which felt correct. She heard the car before she saw it. Not a scream this time. Quiet, unhurried, completely controlled. The approach of someone who wasn't running from anything. A car pulling into her lot with the specific deliberateness of a decision that had been made before the engine was started. She rolled out from under the transmission and stood up. The car was a simple black sedan. No bodyguards, no convoy, no damaged bodywork announcing catastrophe. Marco Bellini stepped out alone, wearing clothes that suggested he'd been somewhere ordinary this morning, doing something ordinary. He looked. She searched for the right word and found it. Lighter. Like a man who had set down something architectural and discovered his posture had changed. He walked to her workbench. He placed a single set of car keys on the surface. Then he looked at her with the expression she'd first glimpsed on the hood of a borrowed car in Detroit at dawn. The one that had no clean mechanical equivalent, and said, "I finally fixed the only thing you couldn't. Myself." He paused. "Does that old marriage offer still need a repair?" Ruby looked at him for a long moment. Then she picked up a grease-stained wrench and held it out. "Only if you're ready to earn it," she said. He took the wrench. She turned back to the transmission, and he crouched beside her without being asked, and they worked. Together, unhurried, in the particular comfortable silence of 2 people who have already survived the worst and are no longer afraid of what comes next. Outside, the Arizona sun climbed higher over the desert. Somewhere across the country, in hundreds of small garages on forgotten roads, honest mechanics opened their bay doors and went to work. Freely, quietly, without fear. Every garage was watching. Now they were watching over something worth protecting.